Welcome to the first training in the 2022 RHY Human Trafficking Training Series, Human Trafficking Screening and Assessment Tools and Practices for RHY Settings. My name is Kendall Arthur, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm located in Columbus, Ohio. I'm a training and capacity building manager with Youth Collaboratory and the RHY point of contact for Regions 1 and 2. FISB awarded a cooperative agreement to Youth Collaboratory to operate RHY, the Runaway and Homeless Youth Training and Technical Assistance Center. RHY is designed to provide Family and Youth Services Bureaus funded runaway and homeless youth grantees and allies in the field with training and technical assistance services and support. The vision of RHY is to strengthen the capacity of communities to meet the immediate needs of youth and young adults experiencing homelessness and housing instability, and assist them with a successful path to adulthood and transition to self-sufficiency. You can visit the RHY website at www.rhytac.net for TA resources and additional training opportunities. You can also request TA through the form that will be dropped in the chat or via email at info@rhytac.net. We're glad you're here for this important topic. We encourage you to remain on camera and ask that you please mute when you are not speaking. There are a lot of participants on the presentation today, but we have members of the RHY team monitoring the chat. So if you have questions that don't get answered today, we will share those questions with our subject matter experts and share those answers as we are able to. With that, I'm pleased to introduce our subject matter experts here today. Amy Boyd is a licensed social worker and mediator/facilitator who has worked with human trafficking survivors for the past 8 years. She is the supervisor of the Human Trafficking Program for YouthWorks and works to advise policy changes and implementation on a state and federal level. YouthWorks, a private nonprofit that serves runaway and homeless, and YouthWorks is a private nonprofit that serves runaway and homeless, trafficked, and street youth. Julia Einbond is the director of the Covenant House Action and Research Tank, or CHART, a project of Covenant House, New Jersey. Since October 2020, CHART has served as the single point of entry for individuals who have experienced human trafficking to access services in New Jersey and provides training and technical assistance on victim identification and services nationally. CHART's research on human trafficking led to the creation of the first scientifically validated brief screening tool for human trafficking, known as the Quick Youth Indicators for Trafficking, or QUIT tool, and has been published in peer-reviewed journals. Finally, Lauren Humphrey is a Youth Catalyst team member and Girls Action board member at Youth Collaboratory. You can learn more about our Youth Catalyst team at the link in the chat. Her passion for humanity and lived expertise have driven the work and accomplishments within the space thus far. In addition to her team building and collaborative skills, Lauren also trains youth in affiliate marketing and entrepreneurship, which has contributed to her knowledge of leadership, as well as building an innate response to the community surrounding her. We'd also like to give a special thanks to Megan Lundberg from YouthWorks North Dakota and Caitlin Zadalis from Covenant House, New Jersey for their contributions to this work. And with that, I'll hand it over to Lauren.
Hey everybody, so as an introduction for today, you'll be hearing about 2 different methods used by leading agencies serving youth and young adults impacted by human trafficking. YouthWorks North Dakota will be sharing expertise on using observational methods for identifying those impacted by trafficking and discuss why those methods work best for the organization. Can you guys hear me?
No, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry, yeah, I'm unmuted, but yeah, so I don't know if you guys heard me about YouthWorks North Dakota, but today they'll be sharing their expertise on using observational methods for identifying those impacted by human trafficking and discuss why those methods work best for the organization. Covenant House, New Jersey will then share their expertise using research-based screening tools and why they have chosen to utilize those methods. While there are differences in the approaches these organizations take to screening and assessments, there are also a lot of similarities such as destigmatization, normalizing experiences, trauma-informed approaches, relational-based encounters, and a focus on non-disclosure. These approaches are used as examples of tools that RHY providers can use. We do not make recommendations about which tools agencies use, rather experts explain why they've landed on these tools for their agencies. We encourage you all to take a deep look at what the capacity for agencies is, methods, procedures you can put in place to screen and assess the young people you serve. And just a quick content warning, today's presentation does deal with topics and themes that can be difficult to process and discuss, so feel free to practice self-care and step away if you need to. And I believe I pass it back to, okay, there we go.
Thank you. Thanks for all the introductions. So I'm Amy Boyd. I'm going to talk, and I'm the one who's affiliated with YouthWorks. I'm going to talk mostly about sex trafficking. YouthWorks has served survivors of domestic sex trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation, and for the last 8 years for sure. But we recognize that Covenant House has more expertise in working with labor traffic victims. And so Julia will, for the most part, take those pieces. So if we just look at the Trafficking Victim Protection Act of 2000, sex trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, all those action verbs, right? Or soliciting of a person for the purposes of a commercial sex act, in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. So that's the sex trafficking part of the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. And Julia will talk more about labor trafficking.
Thanks, Amy. Labor trafficking here, the definition is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. It should sound pretty similar up until this point regarding the means, force, fraud, and coercion, and what use of the body, right? Sex versus labor. For trafficking. It gets different in the next part of the sentence. For the purposes of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. That last part of the sentence does make it a little bit more complicated. It's a slightly higher bar, which we'll talk about later on. Also notice there's no distinction here for age. Amy, back to you.
Thank you. So the way that it makes sense to me is to have sort of a visual, right? So when we're working with youth, and YouthWorks works primarily with youth up to age 24. And we work really closely with law enforcement and prosecution. And so when we look at what are the elements that have to be present for it to be trafficking, if they're over 18, that you have to be able to show means. So the process is all of the actions, right? All of the things that the traffickers are doing to either acquire or using, patronizing, right? Think of patronizing like you're a patron of a shop, right? It's not the kind of patronizing where you talk down to people. That's a different kind of patronizing. And then means is force, fraud, or coercion. And then the end, as Julia talked about, the most important thing to be clear about is, again, if they're over 18, in order to show that it's trafficking, you have to be able to show force, fraud, or coercion. I will tell you that it's usually a combination of all three, that it's rarely just force. It's a combination of all three of those elements. Next slide. So, commercial sexual exploitation of children. We talk a lot about CSEC and tend to probably talk more about that because of our experience. We see the majority of the youth that we serve are.
Hey, this is Jamie.
Hey. Just going to remind people to mute themselves. Thank you. Are what is called non-third party. That is, there isn't another person involved in the transaction. If you have a minor, anybody under the age of 18, and you have commercial sex, so commercial sex is any act for which an item of value, and we don't get to choose what the value is, right? If that's exchanged, then that minor is to be seen as the victim of the crime of human trafficking. And the person who is doing that is the trafficker, right? So there's not a third person involved. There are only two people involved, but that's still trafficking. Next slide. So in plain terms, anybody under the age of 18 who is induced to perform a commercial sex act is a victim of human trafficking. The reason that that's important, we'll talk a little bit more about, but some of the reason that that's important is if your state has a safe harbor law, it's written into those laws typically, and it certainly is in North Dakota, that those youth are to be seen as youth who are in need of protection, not as youth who should be charged with any delinquent crimes, including prostitution, right? Like I will confess, up until 2015 in North Dakota, youth under the age of 18 could be adjudicated delinquent for the crime of prostitution, which is astounding, right? Now under Safe Harbor, so those youth are to be seen as children in need of protection. The other thing to know is whether they give consent or not, it doesn't matter. I mean, clearly consent matters, but under the law, children can't consent to being trafficked. They certainly can't consent to being trafficked into prostitution, right? And then whether they're under 18 or over 18, and Julia can talk about this with labor trafficking.
Sure. So here you notice that whether a youth is under 18 or over 18 doesn't change the application of the definition of labor trafficking. So you don't have that exception here where the consent is determined already by the age. And in the law, I'm a lawyer by training. I remember if that was in my bio, but in my legal practice, right, there are certain times when you don't have to make an argument because you can supply the answer based on the terms in the law. For a labor trafficking victim or purported victim under the age of 18, you still have to make the argument. That doesn't mean that their being under 18 isn't relevant, right? The way that a 14-year-old interprets their ability to leave a situation versus the way a 35-year-old would interpret their ability to leave is, of course, relevant to the determination. It's just not automatic to turn the definition into labor trafficking for a minor.
Yeah, and I thank you. And I also would say that compliance, so we have a little compliance is not consent. It's not. There's a difference, but how that affects the majority of the people that we serve is they will blame themselves because they were compliant. The majority of the youth that we serve that are being traded in exchange for drugs, mostly in our area, is they not only blame themselves for that, but they hold the person who's exploited them blameless, right? And sometimes actually believe that they are taking advantage of that person. It's very complicated and nuanced. Next slide. So the reason that we sort of beat the drum of CSAC is because it's it looks like what people have seen forever, right? And people have not defined it as trafficking. It's only been recently, certainly in North Dakota, and I can't imagine it's not the same in other places, that there's this experience of young people, you know, running away, engaging in relationships with older people, doing drugs, all of those things that quite frankly people are really judgy about and sort of blame youth, right? And I've heard that. I've been a social worker for a really long time, and I can't tell you how many times I have heard social workers make statements like, she admitted to having sex with him, and him being, you know, 30 years old. Which is absurd, right? So we would want to flip the script, and we want people to recognize that these are children who are being exploited, and how can we really view this for what it is, that it is trafficking, and they are being violated, right? The complicated piece is the majority of the people we work with do not believe that they are being exploited. So that is a challenge. So one of the things that happens is youth who experience homelessness and sex trafficking. What is that intersection and what does it look like? And oftentimes people believe that youth are sex trafficked while they're homeless because they need a place to stay. Sometimes that's true, but oftentimes it's because they are, so they're what we call kick out, push out, right? Youth who are not doing well at home, feeling unsupported at home. So they leave and they're looking for a place to belong. And the people who are exploiting them know exactly what to look for. So it's a set of vulnerabilities that increases the likelihood that they may be sex trafficked. So it's important to know it so that you can look for it accurately, if that makes sense. Next slide.
Talking now about labor trafficking among youth experiencing homelessness. Next slide. Here's the definition one more time. At Covenant House, New Jersey, we work with our core population is 18 to 21, up to 24-year-olds for some services, who are experiencing homelessness and seeking shelter or services associated with their homeless experience. We see a lot of young people who are engaging in the labor world. I don't even say the labor market because there are formal and informal types of employment, especially that are happening for our young adult clients. Work can have a very flexible definition for our young people and in the world, even more and more so with more virtual ways of working and changes to the workforce that we've experienced through COVID and changing times. So when we talk about labor exploitation at Covenant House, New Jersey, we see that in various of our relationship-based services. Labor exploitation is not labor trafficking. You need more for labor trafficking. And when we're talking about labor trafficking, you add in these elements of force, fraud, and coercion. Those are those same three means terms that we talk about with sex trafficking. And then you still need more for labor trafficking. You additionally need this element of not being able to leave a situation. Not being able to leave a situation doesn't only mean you're chained down and behind a locked door. It can mean a belief that you are unable to leave a situation. A classic example we see and we hear about is a person who's in an exploitative labor situation where there's force, fraud, or coercion, and they witness another person similarly situated become harmed when they say they're going to leave the situation, right? That's enough, but you do need something like that in order to create this belief that you can't just leave. Needing money is not reason enough. So if your explanation for why you couldn't leave the job is, I couldn't leave the job because I wouldn't have enough money for my rent if I didn't stay, that's not enough, right? So we see that all the time as well in our work at Covenant House, New Jersey. When we talk about the impact of labor trafficking on our clients, we see similar impacts of trauma, sometimes extreme trauma from the situation. Just returning to the same point I made about the extra element needed for labor trafficking, this belief that you are contained, that someone else is in control of your body and your choices can create this extreme trauma response that we see for either gender or non-binary individuals when they experience someone else controlling their body and how that feels and how they perceive that. And I'll bounce back to Amy. Oh no, actually, I'm keeping it, I think, for the case study. So that's the description of labor trafficking. We'll go into a couple of case studies now about sex and labor trafficking. And sorry, before I move on from this slide, just to note what's on the screen, the common type of labor trafficking experienced by Covenant House, New Jersey youth is labor trafficking by forced criminality. We've heard from peers that this type of labor trafficking, this category, isn't known by everyone to be labor trafficking. So the term work, when we're defining work, work can also be something illegal. There is a significant overlap between gang involvement and labor trafficking, a significant overlap between drug sales involvement and labor trafficking. We sometimes see labor trafficking in the commission of sex trafficking. So if someone is being victimized in a sex trafficking situation and they're asked to steal money while they're a victim, right, then there's an added element of an illegal piece of work that could be labor trafficking. At Covenant House, New Jersey, this type of labor trafficking is the majority of labor trafficking that we see. So important to note for our runaway and homeless youth population. All right, next slide. Case studies. I think for the next slide, we have a poll. I'll read the screen and then we'll click over to the poll. Savannah's family home was being foreclosed and her cousin invited her to come to live with her and her husband. The couple told her that she'd have to help with their business to pay for rent. After arriving, Savannah learned the couple was requiring her to help them sell drugs in order to stay there. When Savannah attempted to get another job, they threatened to kick her out and told her that they'd report her to the police if she stopped. Would this still be considered labor trafficking if her family had not threatened to contact the police, right? So this is a labor trafficking example. I just gave it away. Here's the poll. You have the option to answer yes, no, or not sure. So, the answer is, oh, here we go. Thank you. Would this still be considered labor trafficking if her family had not threatened to contact the police? Yes is 85%, no is 7%, not sure is 8%. So I'm interested in these answers. This is why we love doing the interactive parts of these trainings, right? So here you have, just to break down the elements of labor trafficking, right? We know that there is a business and the business is selling drugs. And we can tell just right off the bat that Savannah is being exploited in this way to participate in the business, right? I'm seeing comments pop up that she's being coerced to do this work. I think force, fraud, coercion, we can make an argument for any of those words based on her living situation and the way in which she is coming into this work. So we certainly have the act, we certainly have the mental state. The question here, it doesn't matter that this is illegal, so illegal work is still work for the definition of labor trafficking. So you've got, your two basic typical elements here. And then you want to think about that third element, which is, can Savannah leave this situation? And so it's got to be more than losing something of value. Here, the thing she would lose of value if she were to stop selling these drugs is the place she's living. That is something of value, but she's not locked in this house. She's not trapped in this house. She could go to the street, right? I'm not saying she would even need another housing option, another good housing option. She could become homeless. And that possibility is something, when the legal definition is being applied, would be important to consider, right? The fact here that they are threatening to call the police, meaning that she could end up in jail. That is the kind of entrapment that would certainly rise to labor trafficking, right? It takes away that area of gray. Often when we're looking at labor trafficking, and this can be true for some of our sex trafficking experiences too, here are some details that sound gray, where it might be trafficking, but you might need a little bit more, right? So here the element of the police supplies that little bit more, so there's no question. All right, case study 2. Vince was kicked out of his mother's home when he was 17. He began seeking women out online and would have sex with them in exchange to have a meal and a place to sleep for the night, right? So this is this underage sex trafficking. You do not need force, fraud, or coercion. The idea of compliance or consent is irrelevant to the application of the definition here. If you're meeting Vince when he is 18 years old, was this still sex trafficking? Yes, it happened when he was 17, right? So be aware that if you have access to services and supports for survivors of sex trafficking, the fact that you're meeting them later doesn't change that what happened to them when they were younger was in fact sex trafficking, and they are eligible for services. Case study 3. Melanie and her girlfriend were about to get kicked out of their apartment. Melanie's girlfriend told her that she better go out and make some money and arrange for Melanie to begin having sex for money. When Melanie tried to say no, Melanie's girlfriend would severely beat her. One of the beatings resulted in Melanie going to the hospital. Right, so here we have force in the form of a beating. We have a person requiring another person, right, to sell their body for sex. Here, the fact that Melanie's relationship with the trafficker is her girlfriend is common, right? It's common that a trafficker can be a known person, a family member, a friend, a relationship. The fact that Melanie ended up in the hospital doesn't matter. A beating is a beating, right? So the element that she's ending up in the hospital is an indication to us that sometimes our clients can be seen even before we see them. They're interacting with systems through hospitals. Hospitals are learning about human trafficking too, and how to identify and screen as well. But the severity of the force doesn't matter. You just need to have some force. Amy, back to you. Next slide.
Thank you. So the 3 W's of screening for sex and labor trafficking and exploitation. So this is just our way of sort of organizing how we do this, right? So why? Why do we screen for trafficking? Why is it important to do that? Who screens for trafficking, and who do we screen for trafficking, and when? Those are all things that I'm going to talk about, Julie is going to talk about, but you will hear this over and over again from us, which is the reason why we screen for trafficking is not so that we get a disclosure and so that we learn all the details of what has happened to them. We do that so that we can connect them to services that are specifically designed to work with youth who have experienced any form of trafficking, right? And then who do we screen? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And who does the screening? And then when do we do that? You will hear us say that after the relationship has been established. That's when. Next slide. So why? Why do we screen for human trafficking? One of the things is that the trauma of human trafficking, and particularly of sex trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation, it's a different kind of trauma. It's a complex trauma, and usually on top of trauma that our youth have experienced far before they were trafficked, right? It's one of the sets of vulnerabilities that they have oftentimes, and not always, but oftentimes. Shame. So the amount of shame that people have who have experienced sex trafficking is really high. And there's a difference between shame and being ashamed of something you've done, right? Like I can make a mistake and be embarrassed and think, oh man, I wish I wouldn't have done that, and I'm ashamed and whatever. Shame is the feeling that if people knew who you really were, they would like run screaming from you, right? Like you are fundamentally unacceptable as a human being. And I'm certainly not saying that all of our youth feel this way, but the majority of the youth that I have worked with for the last 8 years feel that way. They feel very isolated. It's multiple sexual assaults, right? So if you are trafficked into prostitution, for example, or sex trafficking as a youth and an adult, you may be having forced sex with somebody 10 times a day, 15 times a day. You don't get to choose who it is that you're having sex with. You don't get to choose what they want to do to you or what you have to do to them. And there's a whole different layer of sexual trauma that comes along with that, and physical trauma because of that, medical trauma, right? The other thing is oftentimes they see themselves just as like a body, right? This is just what I'm good for. This is what people see me as. This is what I'm regarded for. And there's really nothing else I have to contribute. So the fact that they are unique human beings with thoughts and dreams and philosophies is out the window for them, kind of. So the other thing is the medical trauma, which I talked a little bit about, but they may have multiple sexually transmitted infections, reproductive trauma. They may have had forced abortions. In fact, oftentimes are given forced abortions. And then developmental trauma, right? So with youth, we're really aware of the stages of development. That's one of the things that we pay a lot of attention to at YouthWorks. So what is the stage of development that they're in while they're being trafficked? We also even go further, like attachment issues. Do they have attachment issues? What has been their history? And the need, their fundamental need for love and belonging. And we talk about, you know, when I first started doing this work, the narrative kind of nationally, and this was a long time ago, right, was that youth who are homeless will do anything for a place to stay. And that's why. The reason why they are trafficked is only in exchange, or mostly in exchange, for a place to stay, roof over their head, food, clothes, whatever, right? That's the biggest need, that sort of basic need. So what we've discovered, though, is, so we have a shelter, and youth can come into our shelter when they want to, right? We work with them. I think we do a good job. We care about them. They will leave our shelter where they're protected, where they're cared for. And we serve a lot of Indigenous youth. Our office is about 45 miles north of the Standing Rock Sioux Indian Reservation. And we will have youth stay with us and run down to a trap house on the reservation and be sexually assaulted. And it's because their need for love and belonging is, they will sacrifice their safety and their physiological needs for a sense of love and belonging. And then I think Julia is going to talk a little bit more about labor trafficking.
Thank you. Yes, so our experience with clients who've experienced labor trafficking is that their trauma is also serious, right? It's not a competition with trauma. Everyone who comes through our doors has experienced sometimes childhood traumas, sometimes more recent traumas, sometimes homelessness on its own is a trauma, right? Labor trafficking is another experience that adds to trauma. When we've looked through our own research and through research that we have also sought externally, we see that trauma from labor trafficking is not statistically different, right, from sex trafficking trauma, meaning that there are still all of these sequelae from trauma, right? The limitations that come currently and later down the road in life, as far as life expectancy and risk of suicide and risk of all kinds of medical problems. And when you have extreme trauma, right, this is our ACEs, adverse childhood experiences training. But when we think about trauma and why we're so concerned with trauma, it's about helping our clients continue to live a life that is good, or start to live one if that has not been their life so far, right? And so labor trafficking, from the anecdotal stories that we've heard, it has a lot of power dynamics between bosses and employees, right? Employers and employees, which is a dynamic that most individuals will have to continue experiencing for the rest of their adult lives. The power dynamic has caused a control issue, right? A control problem for those who have experienced labor trafficking. And when we serve those clients at Covenant House, New Jersey, we're seeing a similar need for mental health services for that form of trauma. And a similar need for assistance in attaining employment and maintaining employment, the social navigation skills that are needed in order to create a power dynamic with bosses and continue in power dynamics that are healthy and sustainable. Of course, trafficking in any kind of trafficking we've seen has an element of feeling as if the body is needed, or use of the body is needed, in order to earn money, right? To prevent ongoing financial insecurity. And what we hear from individuals who have returned to situations that are risky, or are considering situations that are risky or exploitative, is, well, how else am I going to make money, right? And so this can affect multiple forms of trafficking. Services can be human trafficking specific, right? Specifically around the trauma experienced and the next steps in order to emerge with resilience skills. Next slide. Our goal of using a screening tool when we're thinking about screening for human trafficking and thinking about trying to identify both primary forms of human trafficking, say primary because there are other forms like organ trafficking and other forms of human trafficking, but the primary ones we see here in the US are labor and sex trafficking. Our goal is not to identify more individuals who have experienced trafficking. This is a crucial step, but it's not the goal. The real goal is to identify individuals who have experienced trafficking so we can provide services to them. In person-centered, trauma-informed, resilience-oriented practice, identifying people who have experienced sex and labor trafficking is a means to the goal of connecting clients with the support they need to move forward in their lives. We'll talk about the steps to take before and after using the screening tools, informal or formal methods that you'll hear about today, and provide a readiness checklist to set yourself up for success toward this goal. Next slide. And back to you, Amy.
So at YouthWorks, who do we screen for human trafficking? So all youth that we serve, and one of the things that you'll see or notice the differences between how Covenant House does things and how we do things is we rely really on observation. So all staff are trained in human trafficking, and so know what to look for. And when they see signs that are consistent with what their training has told them, then they would reach out to a member of the anti-trafficking team, and then we would do a more thorough screening, again, relying mostly on observation and normalizing statements. So our street outreach program, the basic center program, transitional living, maternity group home, basically any program that we have at YouthWorks, we believe that we should be screening every youth that walks through the door for potential historical information about being trafficked, because we want to make sure that we connect them to the folks who know how to do that work with them the best, right? With the most experience. And also we believe really strongly in hiring survivors and having a survivor like advisory board. And so it's important that we connect survivors to other survivors so that they have that peer support. We believe in mentoring. So next slide. So when do we screen? So how we do it is after the relationship has been developed. Now, that doesn't mean months, right? In order to work effectively with youth, I think one of the things that you have to do is to be able to establish rapport relatively quickly. And some of our clients, I may have 24 hours with them. I think the record was a youth was brought into our shelter and within 10 minutes was gone. And this was a youth that we were pretty confident had been trafficked, because one of the ways that you can identify a red flag is every other girl that she was running with was being trafficked. And so the likelihood of her having experienced trafficking was really high. So she was gone after 10 minutes. So our philosophy is you really have to develop the relationship. And part of the relationship is meeting them, of course, where they're at. And that particular youth ran again and again and again and again from our shelter. And we have the same response every single time, which is, I'm so happy to see you. Welcome back, right? It's never held against them, right? But they always think it's going to. Oftentimes youth will be like, you're going to be mad at me. I don't want to come back. And it's like, no, we're not. We're not mad at you. Come on back. It's all good. So after the relationship has been developed, now the questions are, how do you do that with drop-in and street outreach and in crisis situations? When the presenting issue is not trafficking, right? They're in the midst of a different crisis. For example, they've just experienced a sexual assault. So I would not be addressing anything then. I would be establishing the relationship. And then at some point, you can put that out there. How I tend to screen is I will use a normalizing statement. I will say, first of all, when I introduce myself, like, so informed consent is a thing. They should know that they're talking to somebody who works with exploited individuals, right? I mean, we're called the anti-trafficking team. It is not ethical to work with a client who doesn't know that they're receiving those services. You have to address it. Typically, how I would say that is, like, I'm Amy and I work in our anti-trafficking or exploitation program, and here's what that is, and I make it really simple. And we'll say, like, the people that I work with are people who experience, like, regularly somebody is having sex with them and giving them something in exchange for that. And usually somebody has asked me to talk to that young person. So then I will say something like, does it make sense to you that, like, Xanthi wanted me to talk to you, right? Xanthi is one of our employees and I'm pretty sure she's on this training. So then, typically the response that I will get is, yeah, because blah, 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 this dude has given me, $100 for a blowjob, right? So then, okay, where do we go from that? Because that's important too. Okay, so how's that, like, where are you at with that? And how's that going? Like, tell me, or don't tell me. Oftentimes what they may say is, ew, that's gross. I would never do that. That's disgusting. Why would you? And then it's equally important what your response is. And your response should not be, oh, good. Your response should be, okay, well, like, I'm not judgy about that. Like, some of my favorite people are people who experience that. So I'm not going to judge it. It's really important that you don't say, oh, good. Because the message that you send if you say, oh, good, is that's too bad and I don't want to hear it and that's a bad thing. So it's important what you do with the information that they've shared with you. Next slide. Go ahead, Julia.
Right, so what you heard from Amy is a method of screening that involves information that Amy already has, right? So just to point out some of the information that Amy already received when she was running through that conversation she has with a young person, she already had a staff member in her organization who said, hey, you should go talk to Amy. And now you have Amy, who has in her title and description of her work something about human trafficking, right? So we already know there's an indication there where Amy is able to start that conversation with that wonderful example of informed consent you heard, and how to have a really trauma-informed conversation in order to potentially identify a victim or survivor of human trafficking. When you have that kind of information, that early kind of information, you do not need a screening tool, right? You already have the result that a screening tool gives you. So in that kind of example, I call that example red flag indications or informal indications, but you already have information that a person may have been trafficked, right? A screening tool is a type of device when you don't have that information. And so I just wanted to give that definition. I see the poll question has already taken place on the screen, which is, how do you currently identify youth impacted by trafficking, right? One is using a tool, which we'll talk about coming up. One is using observation, right? Amy gave some great examples of observation. One is not currently identifying, and one is struggling with how to identify, right? So I see 1/3, 1/3, and I'm going to put the last two together as 1/3. And so that's great. We're all in different places, and which gives a lot of opportunity to talk about different approaches. So on your screen, you see the difference between assessments and screening tools. So just to talk a little bit about a terminology, right? Terminology comes up a lot in this presentation, and I know it can get confusing, right? So an assessment is a thorough review of what has happened. Undergoing an assessment can be re-traumatizing for victims and should be avoided while delivering trauma-informed care. We'll get to that later, right? But what you heard from Amy and what you're hearing from me now, neither one of these is an assessment, right? So an assessment is what we're not talking about until towards the end of the presentation. There is a place for assessment, but it's not at this initial stage of inquiry that we're talking about now. A screening tool reveals what has happened to someone so you can help them move forward, not find out more about it. Next slide. A screening tool indicates the likelihood of trafficking without requiring or even requesting disclosure, right? So to just drill down on that, the past comment I made, which is really important here, Amy already knows with the client she spoke to that there's a likelihood of trafficking. The result of using a screening tool is getting to a likelihood of trafficking, which is why for a client like the one who Amy described, you wouldn't be using one of these formal screening tools, right? You'd continue with the method Amy's discussing, screening, or one of the assessment tools that we can share further down in the presentation. Next slide. When we're inviting someone to disclose what's happened to them, right? So disclosure here is what we are saying is not a best practice typically, right? About details. Disclosure, we're looking here about just whether someone is a victim or survivor. It's important to think about building a relationship. Do this through trust and privacy. Avoid an assessment about trauma unless it's completely necessary. Next slide. Why do we avoid trauma assessments? We've heard from young people that they're worried about stigma around trafficking. A lot of people have heard the term trafficking, but don't know exactly what it is. They feel embarrassed to be counted in this category. There's concern about blame as well. Sometimes people have fear and confusion about how they got into a trafficking situation. They wonder what their own responsibility was for ending up in that situation, right? Amy talked a lot about shame that clients experience. And some youth feel it's pointless for a service provider to ask about trafficking experiences when the experience is over or they don't see a way out. They wonder what you could possibly do to help them. Next slide. So disclosure is not the goal. Eliciting stories from victims can be re-traumatizing. When determining how to provide services, we're trying to find out what happened to them and how the experience affected them. We are not framing the question as what's wrong with you. Next slide. Avoid expert mode. Expert mode means positioning yourself as knowing more about the person than they know about themselves. That's not how we provide services now, right? That's not trauma-informed care. This should be a term you're familiar with. This should draw on experience you've had from other trainings about trauma-informed care and strength-based client-centered work, right? We focus on partnership mode, where we keep the individual who's experienced trafficking always in the driver's seat. They choose how much to share. This is vital to allow individuals to maintain control of their lives and narratives wherever they can, a key component of trauma-informed care in your program. Next slide. Building trust. I'll just quickly read through some of these check boxes. These should all be familiar as strategies to providing excellent trauma-informed care. Emphasize opportunities for choice and control. Don't force labels. Find opportunities for choice, right? Sit wherever you'd like. Make sure there's access to a door. Be predictable. So today we're going to explain what you're doing as you're doing it. Be present and attentive. Practice non-judgmental listening. Be aware of a young person's nonverbal cues, fidgeting, changes in breathing, avoiding eye contact. Suggest breaks when you see dysregulation. Next slide. Never force disclosure and request as little disclosure as possible. Don't ask a question unless it's in the context of wanting to help. Once you have determined that the person has been trafficked, discontinue the questions. Be as conversational as possible. Protect privacy, explain when you would have to disclose and to whom. Consider only making human trafficking status available to necessary staff. Next slide. Okay, so now we'll dig a deeper into screening tools. These are these formal method of screening when you do not have a red flag indicator that someone in your population has experienced trafficking. Next slide. The screening tool is used as the first phase with anyone who might present in your environment. Once you've concluded the broad inquiry and you have an indication as who is likely to have been trafficked, that's all you have, someone who's likely to have been trafficked. At that point, it's appropriate to do a risk and safety assessment on those who have a positive marker for trafficking from the screening tool so that those individuals can be properly served with services that are tailored to them. As I mentioned, we'll get into assessment right at the very end. Typically, an assessment would be conducted by a licensed professional or an expert in human trafficking and the trauma experienced by survivors. After the risk and safety assessment, you determine what the intervention is and what those services might be. These steps are necessary to meet your goal for using the screening tool to serve more individuals who have experienced trafficking and to serve them better. We'll talk about a readiness checklist to guide you through the process later on. Next slide. Quick youth indicators for trafficking. Today I'm going to tell you about QUIT. It is a screening tool developed by Covenant House, New Jersey in 2017. We did a study at our sites in New Jersey in collaboration with Mount Sinai, with researchers there who worked in the emergency department, who are experts at human trafficking and interested to learn more about the experiences of youth experiencing homelessness around trafficking. The client population we serve at Covenant House, New Jersey, and at that time was 18 to 21-year-old minors. 18 to 21-year-olds, not minors. And so this study did not talk to anyone under the age of 18, right? This is important for me to bring up again later. You know, we're talking to a lot of RHY grantees, and you might be serving a wider population at your sites, and we'll talk about that. The way we conducted this study was a little different from the way a lot of scientists and practitioners conduct their research around human trafficking. The data was anonymous when our collaborators looked at it, but it wasn't anonymous to us. So we were able to conduct our screening tool with clients who we were serving with a full array of services, including residential housing, in one of our sites, right? It might have been a crisis center, it might have been an apartment, it might have been a transitional housing unit, it might have been our mothers and babies program. And we were able to continue our relationship with that client through screening, assessment, and services. By conducting a non-anonymous study, right, we were able to see any potential impacts, positive or negative, of participating in a study. We were able to stop asking questions if we saw any of those nonverbal cues that I talked about already, right? Research is not the most important thing. The most important thing is the client in front of us. So while we met all of the marks of formal research and we talked to hundreds of clients over a longitudinal period, we always put the client first. That means that we also incorporated youth and survivor voice into the development of the materials we used during the study and to our findings when we completed the study at the end. This is part of our client-centered approach to research that we use at CHART, the Covenant House Action and Research Tank at Covenant House, New Jersey. Next slide. So who can perform a quit screening? Staff with any experience level and no formal training, right? So here, what you might notice is that you don't need any particular license to use quit. You don't need any particular training other than what we're talking about now, best practices around trauma-informed care that you're all learning in your sites. Anyway, you also don't need training in human trafficking. That doesn't mean it's not recommended, right? We recommend that everyone who's working with our RHY population have an understanding of what human trafficking is and what it might look like, but you don't need that to use quit. All you need is the quit tool in front of you. Next slide. This is the tool. So the first two questions here talk about work situations. I can read them quickly, right? Number one, it is not uncommon for young people to stay in work situations that are risky or even dangerous simply because they have no other options. This is one of those destigmatizing or normalizing sentences that Amy and I have both talked about that builds in this resilience-oriented, trauma-informed characteristic to the tool itself, right? Which is part of why you need less training for someone to just read the words off the page. The trauma-informed part is built in. The question comes next. Have you ever worked or done other things in a place that made you feel scared or unsafe? Right, partnership mode. This is, you're not an expert in someone else's life. You're asking them a question just about what their experience has been about their own life, right? Question number two, sometimes people are prevented from leaving an unfair or unsafe work situation by their employers. Have you ever been afraid to leave or quit a work situation due to fears of violence or threats of harm to yourself or your family? Right. So here, if somebody responds to one of these first two questions, other than a yes, no, which is what all of these four questions are dichotomous, right? Yes or no. You're not eliciting a story, a sentence, anything else. But if somebody responds, I've never worked, it's not relevant to me, right? You can supply there some help. We're also talking about informal work. You don't have to receive a paycheck in order for something to be work. You might be having this conversation with your clients in other contexts, right, in the work that you're doing. But that definition of work might be helpful. Sometimes people get paid in cash or they're not paid at all, right? So this is a very expansive view of what work is. Question three, here we start to talk about homelessness, right? Question three, sometimes young people who are homeless or who are having difficulties with their families have very few options to survive or fulfill their basic needs, such as food or shelter, food and shelter. If the client you're serving doesn't use the word homeless to describe themselves, right? Take out the label. The sentence works without it. Sometimes young people who are having difficulty with their families have very few options. You can supply whatever makes sense for the client sitting in front of you there, right? So if you're, the service that you're working in is not residential, if it's a drop-in center and you know the person's housed, you might want to make that tweak to the sentence, right? You can also use whatever language the client has said to you. Like they might have said that they don't have a place to stay right now, or they're moving around a lot and have very few options. The next sentence asks the question, have you ever received anything in exchange for sex? The parenthetical here explains it doesn't just have to be money, right? It can be a place to stay, gifts, or food. It can be something of value, anything of value. This question will over-identify positives, meaning that you will have more yeses to this question than you have sex trafficking, because the words in this question will also identify survival sex, right? Survival sex, I think we haven't talked about that term, but it's essentially the exchange of commercial sex for something of value, but you are lacking either the element that someone is under 18 or force, fraud, or coercion, right? Force, fraud, and coercion are legal words that it can take a lawyer to interpret. We don't ask clients to be the lawyer for their own life, right? So we're not asking force, fraud, or coercion here. We are intentionally allowing for this over-identification, which leads us to the likelihood of trafficking, not a guarantee of trafficking. This question I also want to point out, just to remind everyone, this question is one big reason this tool is not validated for under 18-year-olds, right? Because if you have a yes to this question, you've just heard trafficking, right? So that would trigger some other possibilities like your mandated reporting responsibilities and other concerns. It doesn't mean you can't use this tool for someone who is under 18. It just means you need to take note that you're using this tool in a different context from what it was validated in. And I'll walk through a little later what that means when a tool moves from being validated to evidence-based and how you can adapt it to your setting in that circumstance. Question 4 reinforces the idea of casual work. Sometimes employers don't want people to know about the kind of work they have young employees doing. To protect themselves, they ask their employees to lie about the kind of work they are involved in. Have you ever worked for someone who asked you to lie while speaking to others about the work you do? This question provides the same clarification about employers and employees, right? Those can be terms people think of formally. It can also be informal or casual. At first glance for this tool, it might look like 3 questions about labor trafficking and 1 about sex trafficking. That is not how the tool performs. We have yes answers from victims and survivors of sex trafficking, sometimes to one of the other questions. Sometimes a young person isn't comfortable answering question 3, honestly, potentially, but they might answer yes to one of the other ones. A yes to any one of these questions is a positive response on the screening tool. Next slide. So you'll notice that QUIT is broad, has yes, no questions that minimize the need to share details or retell and relive trauma. Our advice to practitioners is when you're conducting QUIT, if someone starts to share a story with you in that time, to, in a collaborative way, help them to pause the retelling of that story in that moment, to let them know that there might be someone else who, or a different conversation or experience where they would have the opportunity to disclose more information to someone who might be able to serve them better. And we'll talk further down the presentation about how to provide sort of that next step past the screening phase. But the goal here is the person who's giving the screening tool may not be the best person to support a client who is going to retell a trauma experience, right? That can require or benefit from some training. Retellings can be re-traumatizing. So these screening tools balance trauma with resilience. The first question is destigmatizing and normalizing and educates the person about education. Question 2 uses a trauma-informed structure by asking, has this ever happened to you? The tool is brief. This is always explained to me as the #1 greatest factor of the tool. It takes less than 5 minutes to complete. Next slide. If a person answers yes to even 1 question, that gives them a positive score. The higher the score, right, you can have a maximum score of 4, the more likely the person is to have experienced human trafficking. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but as you're thinking about the efficiency of using a screening tool in your environment, depending on how many clients you have, how many you're serving, and how many positive responses you get, if you need to make hard decisions about who to speak to first after using a screening tool, and you have someone who has a score of 4 versus someone who has a score of 1, the person who has a score of 4 has almost certainly been trafficked based on the data. Our findings were 100% of those in our study who had received a score of 4 were trafficked, had experienced trafficking. So that's a person who would benefit from the next steps. Someone who's experienced who has a score of 1 might have experienced another form of exploitation which wasn't trafficking, or they might have experienced trafficking, right? You want to get to those clients as soon as possible, but depending on your volume, the number might help you prioritize. Amy, I see you unmuting. Do you want to jump in? No? Okay. Next slide. Quit was the only tool with true scientific validity for individuals aged 18 and over back in 2017 when we validated it. Now there is RAFT, which stands for the Rapid Assessment for Trafficking. It's a tool based on Quit that was created for healthcare providers. It was tested in the emergency department setting. You could also use RAFT for an RHY setting. It would then become an evidence-based tool because it wasn't tested in that setting. If you look at RAFT, you'll see the questions are almost exactly the same. There's one question that's different, but our co-author is the one who validated RAFT. So it's an extremely similar tool. Two of the questions are a little bit shorter. Quit has gold standard validation where we use the tool with our entire population of clients at Covenant House, New Jersey over a period of more than 1 year. That's called a longitudinal study. The gold standard is to talk to everyone, trafficked and untrafficked. For our research, we then asked for informed consent before conducting a diagnostic assessment with our entire population, including those who tested negative on Quit. Through this approach, we were able not only to look at false positives, but also measure any false negatives captured by Quit. This is different from other tools often referred to as evidence-based that conducted research to confirm trafficking only for the individuals who screened positive on the test tool. Next slide. So what the validation process reveals, just to bore you all with the numbers, right? When we talk about a validated tool, you should know what that word means so you can decide whether it's important, right? Results are 87% sensitive. For good sensitivity, we look for a number over 80%. Sensitive is a scientific term. That means how successful is this tool at positively identifying human trafficking survivors? Results are 75% specific. Specific is another research term. It means how successful is Quit, this tool, at minimizing false positives. And then here, this third number, 96%. If you get 2 yes answers on the Quit, specificity increases to 96%. This is an important detail because it allows you to prioritize assessments of individuals with a score of 2 to 4. These individuals have experienced trafficking with very few exceptions. Next slide. So I'll show you an example of what these percentages mean. In this case, we screen 1,000 youth with Quit, right? So 1,000 is a fair number for how many individuals Covenant House, New Jersey talks to across all of its work in the state of New Jersey, whether we're serving clients who we are meeting through outreach, clients who are coming into one of our residential settings who we have absolutely no indication whether they've been trafficked or not. They are merely coming to seek shelter with us. Some clients stay for a day and are seeking food and a shower. Some stay for months. Others will stay with us for years as they navigate through longer term options for housing, which may include voucher apartments and transitional living programs, right? But when you think about sort of what is your population number, right? Your population number might be 50, it might be 5,000, right? Depending on the size of your program. I'm trying to break down for you sort of how Quit will help you to navigate the next stages, right? So out of 1,000 youth screened, you would expect that 312 would screen positive. That's a score of 1, 2, 3, or 4, right? So you already know that you don't need to be speaking to over 600 clients, 688, right? 688 clients scored 0 on Quit by this number tool. And if you are trying to figure out who needs an assessment or prioritize who needs an assessment the soonest, that will let you cut out that 688 from your next, often much more time-consuming steps that require often a higher level of expertise, right? 87 of those who screened positive in a next stage of assessment were ultimately identified as having experienced human trafficking, right? So this tells you that 225 of those positive quits, you can do the next click on the slide, 225 were false positives. Those false positives, in our experience, about a third of them had another explanation, like survival sex, right? Or like another form of exploitation. Some of those experiences were also helpful for us to know upon an assessment so that we could serve our clients the best possible for their own experiences. Out of the 1,000 youth screened, 13 clients in our experience out of this number would have been trafficked, would have experienced trafficking, and we would have missed them because they would have answered all no's to quit tool. That 13 number is a small number, but it's an important one, right? We don't want to miss anyone. That's not part of what we're trying to do in our programs, which is why having training on human trafficking is helpful. Knowing how to identify signs of human trafficking is helpful, and considering that for clients you're serving for longer, you may want to repeat the quit screening tool further down the line in your relationship. Next slide. As I mentioned, we serve clients for all different lengths of time, and we would expect that for service providers who are working with the RHY population. If you're serving clients for a very brief period of time, if you don't have a private setting in order to have conversations with clients, if you are unsure of what your internal processes will be for assessment or what your referrals will be for services, it might be a better choice for you to use a universal screening tool. And I have one example on the screen to show you. Universal screening tools universal education tools and screening tools can also be used together. They're two different ways to have a conversation with a client, both of which are trauma informed. The use of which tool to use and how to use it, right, depends on these questions about what population you're serving, availability of a validated or evidence-based tool, and what kind of privacy and referral options you have. The tool you're seeing on your screen is called the PAIR tool. It was created for practice in a healthcare setting. The flow of information in a universal education tool is from the provider to the patient or to the client, right? In this case, you're not asking the client any questions about their experiences. You're letting them know that human trafficking is something that happens. And you're giving them an opportunity to let you know in this conversation or a future conversation that this is something that may have happened to them, right? You're also letting them know that this is the kind of information that is important to you to know, and that if you knew this information, you might have a different ability to serve the client with additional services or a more tailored approach, right? The PAIR tool is also more general than QUIT. QUIT is only for sex and labor trafficking. The PAIR tool talks also about domestic violence and letting clients know that there's a place for them to talk about that if that happened to them as well. Next slide, and Amy, over to you.
So our agency is a very small agency in a small state, North Dakota, right? Which is extremely rural. Even our urban areas are relatively rural. And so what we did is, in essence, develop our own set of indicators, because what we found in some of the indicators that we had been shared with us is that we were missing some of our youth. And so we've identified our own, and we call it the eligibility tool. And it really is relying on observation and collateral information, as Julia was talking about, to do like basically a checklist, right? Like, is this youth? So one of the things that we noticed is if you are working with a youth who is insecurely housed, right? Or on the run, struggling, but you've known them for a long time, which is the case. We usually know our clients off and on for a long over time. And they've gone from using marijuana to they are shooting up heroin or smoking blues, right? Fentanyl. And they've got a new group of friends, and they're being found by law enforcement in a hotel room with an adult male who is not a family member. They're being intervened with by law enforcement because law enforcement is pulling over a vehicle in the middle of the night that's got an adult male in it and a 14-year-old. And typically what would happen in our community is, and I'm not being disrespectful to law enforcement, we work really closely with them, and but they would sort of shoo the man away and take the kid back home to where they lived, right? It was a very unthinking response about what could be happening. And so we did a lot of training and education with our community partners on here's what we're seeing. And as we work more with these youth, they're disclosing that they're being trafficked. And so it's more of an eligibility tool for our own purposes. And then the other thing that we use, forever we called it the Jefferson County tool. I don't know why we called it. Maybe it was called that. And then in doing some research, it's actually called the Colorado High Risk Victim Youth Identification Tool. And that is widely available. And I can certainly send a link, put a link in the chat to finding that tool. But again, it's observation. The See It is also a tool that people can use, which is really heavily reliant on observation. Next slide. So if you are going to engage in a conversation with a youth with the goal of not missing anything, right? Like, it's important to know why, like we talk about, why are we screening for trafficking, right? It's not so that we get, I think people get enamored sometimes of the kind of shocking information that they get. And that's not why we're doing that. We don't need that information, but we are knowing why we're doing that. And it's so that we can get them to the right provider. We can provide the right supportive services to them. So know what it is that you're looking for, the signs of it. And then rather than asking questions directly about the trafficking, right? You could be asking, so for example, if you have a youth in front of you that's been on the run for 6 months, right? 4 months, something like that. And they were picked up with some adults, and they're coming down off of a combination of, like, my personal favorite, meth and fentanyl, which not my personal, I don't ingest that, but it's one of the worst combinations that I've seen with our youth. One of the questions that I may ask is, did anything seem really like effed up to you when you were in that situation? So I don't talk about safety, because safety for me is a very different concept than safety for my client. So safety needs to be defined, first of all. And so instead of saying, were you safe? I may say, did you think at any point somebody was going to hurt you? Like, did you think, or like, were you afraid you were going to get hurt, right? Like, really hurt. So you're not asking specifically about trafficking. You're asking about trauma and safety and how are they, basically. No questions about details of the trafficking. All of the staff in the agency should be trained in human trafficking. And I would go so far as to say all of the staff in your agency, including your front, thank you, Regina, appreciate you linking that in the chat, including your front desk person, should be trained in trauma, certainly, right? Because how often have you had the experience of a client is finally ready to go get some assistance, whether that's at a clinic, like wherever, and the front desk person is not trained in trauma, and their demeanor is such that your client is going, I'm never going back there. They were rude, they didn't get me, they whatever. So your whole staff should be trained in what is human trafficking, all forms, and they should all be trained in trauma informed. If you are going to be the person who is intervening and screening for trafficking, I want you to be role playing how to do that, and how I would want them to observe how staff do what they do with clients. Next slide. So something that's really important is called use of self. It's really different than self-disclosure. Self-disclosure, for those of you who are licensed social workers, where it really is kind of frowned upon, right? In the social work profession, you have to be really judicious about when you use self-disclosure. Although there's some really interesting research about the connection between shame and people who've experienced trauma, and the role of really careful, thoughtful self-disclosure can have in some healing for those individuals. But use of self is your unique personality, like what makes you who you are. Use that with youth. I mean, anybody who works with youth, anybody who works with humans should not be overly, you shouldn't be stiff, right? You should be your authentic person. Youth can tell in a minute if you're authentic or if you're not, and they can tell if you care or not. So be authentic. Nobody else can be you, right? The way that I do things is really different than one of my colleagues. We're both good, but her way works for her, my way works for me. I also want to have a conversation with staff about, like, what happens when you hear something, and are you worried about what you're going to do next? We've definitely had the experience of staff kind of freezing, right? A client has shared something, and like Julia referenced, the goal is not disclosure, but sometimes people do. Like, oftentimes we have clients who like stream of consciousness almost. And then staff is like, I don't know what to do with this. I'm overwhelmed with this. So it's important that those things are addressed. Basically, whoever in your agency is going to be responsible for doing that type of intervention and screening needs to be trained really well by the person who's done the work for a long time, in my opinion. Next slide. So what you're learning from us are two different, it's really different. Covenant House, and Julia and I talked about this when we first started prepping for this training, right? Like, YouthWorks, a small agency in North Dakota, has significant differences from Covenant House, New Jersey, right? And so it makes sense that as you listen to all of this, you're processing what makes sense for your agency. Maybe you're already doing this and you feel really good about how you're doing this, but maybe you're going to be taking a look at, are we going to do something like use the quit tool, and we're going to use that in the way Julia describes it? Are you going to rely on, does it make more sense in your organization to rely on observation and conversational intervention, if you will? Julia, is there anything you want to say about this?
Sure. Thanks, Amy. Yeah, so just about how we use our approach, we use a formal approach, right, which would include the use of a screening tool. We are a relatively large organization and serve a relatively large client base, right? So we have the ability to have different staff positions who have different types of information, right? So we can keep information confidential when we need to, when that serves the client's case plan the best for them, right? So we do conduct our screening tool, the quit tool, with every client who comes into our shelter services or who seeks any of our housing related services. We like that approach because it helps us avoid an ideal victim bias with such a large organization, right? We're not all experts like Amy at our organization. I wish we were, that would be awesome. But we are running 24/7 sites, right? 7 sites throughout the state of New Jersey. We just don't have the capacity for that level of expertise. And we want to make sure that when we train all of our staff on human trafficking, which we do, that our staff isn't just looking for a girl who has a tattoo or bruises, who's not able to make eye contact, right? Those are what some victims of trafficking present as, but we have male victims of sex trafficking. We have labor trafficking victims. We have labor and sex trafficking victims, and we have services that are specific to any victim of human trafficking. And so when we miss being able to identify a victim of human trafficking who seeks services from one of our staff somewhere in the state, we're missing the possibility of providing them an apartment or extra funding, right? Something that might really help them in their experience and life. So we use the screening tool for our entire population to try to capture the likelihood that anyone has experienced human trafficking. We then have the capacity to refer all positive screens to someone for an assessment. We have only a couple of minutes left of this presentation. I'll talk about assessments very briefly after this, but you don't have to do assessments internally if you have an organization in your community that does have an expert like Amy or like me who can talk to someone about their experience, right? You don't have to use an assessment tool because the answers to any specific question there aren't important. It's just getting the information needed to determine whether you can identify someone as having experienced human trafficking. And then, of course, you also want to make sure that you have somewhere to refer someone for services if they have experienced human trafficking and have an interest in those services. Back to you, Amy.
Next slide. Okay, so then sort of wrapping it up, can your agency do this? Or maybe you already are. What needs to be considered? Where will you do the screenings, right? And who will do that? And then what can you do? This work it's hard, right? And it's heartbreaking. And oftentimes you will hear things from clients that like, I just have an incredible amount of sorrow for what they've experienced. It makes me sad. Like I don't pity them and I don't feel sorry for them, but it makes me sad that they've experienced that. So it's work to just go to the place of empathy, right? Just empathy. It's not pity. It's not sympathy. And sort of my jam is unconditional positive regard. Exactly what it sounds like. So when a person is in front of you, you have unconditional positive regard for that human being, regardless of what they've done, who they are. You regard them positively no matter what. And no matter what, every time a youth walks through the front door or back door, side door, whatever door they walk in, we are happy to see them. We believe that, and I think it was Maya Angelou who said, there should be somebody, some adult that lights up when a kid walks through the door, right? Every kid deserves that, every youth. Every youth deserves when they walk through the door, when somebody sees them, that you light up, that you're happy to see them. At the end of the day, that's really important. So next slide.
Well, I almost don't want to say another word because what's more important than that, but it's 1 minute over time. So I'm just going to end here to say we have 4 more slides about assessments. When you're emailed the slide deck, you will see these slides about assessments. If you go to the next slide, past the title slide, you will see a bullet point list of diagnostic assessment tools. These are all available online. Links I've seen pop up in the chat. And they'll be available after this training. These are all great assessment tools. The top 2 have been validated and studied at length. The third one is evidence-based and was developed by some folks within one of the federal agencies. And they are all mechanisms to become an expert like Amy. I'm a lawyer by training, which makes me very boring and means that every time I talk to anyone, I like to have a document in front of me. So I still use a tool, even though I would call myself an expert in human trafficking. I just find it an aid to myself. But that's the only reason to use these. The individual answers don't matter, and they just are a guided way to definitively identify a victim of human trafficking. Thank you all for your time. I'm going to pass back to Kendall for closing remarks.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Oh, sorry, I went too far on the slides. I apologize. So please feel free to type your questions in the chat. Unfortunately, we don't have time to answer very many of them now, but we will collect all of those questions and we will send them to Amy and Julia for answers and share those answers with you. We hope you found this information useful and would like to stress some key takeaways before we close out. Please keep in mind that these tools, processes, and resources shared today are examples of what our experts have found to work best for their agencies. We encourage you to consider the following when deciding what works best for you. The 3 W's: why, who, and when to conduct screenings and assessments. Trauma-informed best practices. Your capacity to utilize various tools and research on the various tools and best practices that exist. Finally, in the coming weeks, we will be releasing the recording of this training as well as a tip sheet on screening and assessments for human trafficking in RHY settings. Please take the time to complete this evaluation that will be dropped in the chat. This information helps us determine which trainings we offer in the future, and it makes a difference. We'd also like to invite you to the second training in this series, Culturally Responsive Practices for Youth Experiencing Homelessness, Exploitation, and Human Trafficking, which will be announced soon. Additionally, registration for the 2022 National RHY Grantee Training will be sent out soon, and we encourage you all to attend as this year has some truly amazing topics and presenters. A special thanks to our subject matter experts for their time and expertise, and a thank you to you too for attending.